Je pense qu'on peut débuter. Bonjour, bienvenue à tous et à toutes à ce dernier bloc de notre 4e édition du colloque annuel du département d'anthropologie. C'est vraiment un plaisir de pouvoir terminer ces 4 journées-là avec vous. Donc, je vais céder la parole à M. Crépeau qui va présenter en fait les conférencières du bloc Perspectives et représentations autochtones. Merci.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Myriam. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Merci d'être là pour ce dernier bloc du CADA. Et donc, je voulais remercier les organisateurs, organisatrices en fait, du CADA, du comité organisateur, donc pour l'invitation d'abord à animer ce bloc et également pour l'organisation de ces journées. Je pense que ça a été extrêmement intéressant. Et donc, merci à tout ce comité organisateur du CADA. Donc, cet après-midi, on a 2 présentations qui vont durer une vingtaine de minutes chacune, avec une période de questions d'une dizaine de minutes. Donc, la première présentatrice est Emma Palladino, que j'ai le plaisir de côtoyer tous les vendredis matins au séminaire de rédaction de mémoire. Et donc, on va parler aujourd'hui avec Emma de Bodies of Meaning. Emma, qui est candidate à la maîtrise à l'Université de Montréal. Donc, Emma, la parole est à toi.
Super. Je m'excuse en avance, c'est pas la COVID, c'est juste je suis malade. Donc, ouais, je commence la présentation, c'est ça?
Tu peux y aller.
Cool. Donc, j'ai partagé mon écran. Vous allez me dire si ça marche ou pas. Great. So today, my presentation is Bodies of Meaning, exploring the variability of North American Indigenous perspectives on the display of human remains. We're going to be specifically looking at a couple case studies in Canada, as well as in the United States and Mexico, most notably. So just to get a little bit of clarification, this is what I mean when I'm going to be talking about display. So this is taken from the Tamaki Macau Rao Accord on the display of human remains and sacred objects, which was passed by the World Archaeological Congress in 2005. So since the archaeological reflexive turn at the end of the 20th century, there's been an ever-increasing concern in our community about how best to honor Indigenous cultural practices and how best to collaborate earnestly with descendant communities around the world. To be sure, we definitely still have a long way to go. That's not to say that every archaeologist has jumped on board emphatically. And yet, as marginalized voices gain more ground, the discipline seems to be inching towards new futures and new possibilities for collaboration and knowledge production. So this movement has extended most unsurprisingly to the fields of burial archaeology, osteoarchaeology, and museum ethics. It's in these spaces where human remains are concerned that some of the most emotional and sensitive conversations have taken place. These discussions are the subject of this presentation in a North American context. So my argument is essentially that the question of whether or not the display of Indigenous human remains is ethical is the wrong one to ask. Rather, archaeologists should be looking at the culturally specific practices and desires of each individual Indigenous community in each case. So furthermore, whether an Indigenous community permits the display of ancestors, this decision is ultimately an affirmation of sovereignty and a deep connection to the land. So we're going to first be looking at some of the theoretical backgrounds that frame this question. So what does it mean to be a body? Is a body a thing? Is a body a person, something else? And what are the implications of this? Next, we'll be talking a bit about Indigenous notions of belonging. So how do we identify the descendant community of a set of ancestral remains? And how do imposed colonial and Indigenous notions of indigeneity clash? And how can non-Indigenous archaeologists honor these lineages? Finally, we're going to be talking about a couple of contemporary case studies, and I'll discuss how ancestral Indigenous human remains are intimately linked to both current-day Indigenous struggles against colonial powers, showing how they affirm both the sovereignty and legitimacy of Indigenous land claims. So let's start with a couple of contemporary case studies. So what does it mean to be a body? This is still very contentious of a question. And if we look at our own little anthropology community, it's still very much debated because these are some of the biggest news about archaeology to hit the mainstream in the last 2 years. Notably 2 stories that discuss the mishandling of Indigenous and Black human remains. For those who maybe aren't as familiar with the particulars, on the left, this is a screen grab from the Daily Mail discussing the anthropologist Elizabeth Weiss at San Jose State University. In 2020, she co-authored a book decrying the repatriation of Indigenous human remains, arguing that these remains hold more scientific value than any possible religious or sentimental meaning. And this year she went viral for posting pictures of her smiling, holding human bones, which she argued was her right because they are not people, just bones. And in 2021, it came out that sets of human remains, including those belonging to children, from murdered Black Americans were being used by Princeton and UPenn as teaching tools. These individuals were brutally murdered via firebombing by the Philadelphia police in 1985. And their remains were being handled, videotaped, circulated, and used as tools without the knowledge or consent of their families. In one case, the body of a girl as young as 12 years old, whose parents are still alive. So anthropology surely has a body problem fueled by the blind ignorance of certain researchers. So how to approach the issue? So let's start by understanding that the body overlaps 2 worlds, the physical world, which is the tangible, the here and now, and the metaphysical, which is the intangible, the emotional, the spiritual. Like I can hold a human skull in my hands and I can see it as an interesting subject of research. I can use this to learn about past diet, about status, paleopathology, about gender, possibly even warfare, for example. And many anthropologists like Weiss see that as the limit of how useful that object is. However, in order to conduct any meaningful, holistic, and responsible research, I need to go to that second level of being. I need to acknowledge the meanings. So as Abenaki archaeologist Marge Bruchac reminds us, human remains function as physical links to the metaphysical world of the ancestors. Human remains are living beings. They command all of the respect and dignity that they were worthy of in life. And when these remains are held hostage in foreign museums or collections, that fracture is felt by members of the community. So another major issue is how we understand indigeneity as anthropologists. A common excuse among archaeologists debating the fate of Indigenous ancestral remains is that if the bones are old enough, going back thousands or even hundreds of years, there's just no way to identify the true descendant community today. We also have colonial dispossession to thank for that. And if no community of descent can be identified, then there's no need to collaborate or communicate with any living Indigenous groups in order to learn what they want. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act kind of works in this way. On paper, it acknowledges the diverse forms of Indigenous belonging, but in practice, Indigenous communities are often fresh out of luck. Turning to Canada, our own Indian Act is a perfect example of this colonial mindset. This piece of legislation, which has existed since 1876, places very strict limits on who's legally considered Indigenous. The only way currently to claim Indigenous status in Canada is to prove Indigenous familial descent. So that's where the notorious blood quantum comes from. A certain percentage of Indigenous blood is required to prove one's own existence. And the Indian Act is just one example of this, how arbitrary these standards are and how they're constantly changing. Because up until the 1980s, for example, if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she lost her status and couldn't pass it on to her kids. It's always changing, it's always arbitrary. So the right to self-determination is one of the most fundamental human rights that is specifically highlighted in UNDRIP, which is United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this makes sense, as being able to define oneself, to be able to belong to something, is one of the most basic elements of what it means to be human. The right to make that definition of belonging free of colonial imposition is a human right. And in North America, Indigenous ideas of belonging do not, as we've seen, necessarily overlap with colonial ones. Instead, indigeneity is understood as being intrinsically linked to the land, to those who came before you and to those who claim you. By virtue of sharing the same land as Indigenous groups hundreds or even thousands of years in the past, there exists an unbreakable link of belonging. So some of us may be familiar with the story of the Ancient One, also called the Kennewick Man by researchers and media. This was a 9,000-year-old set of human remains found in what is now Washington State in 1996. Due to the age of these remains, some prominent archaeologists argued that this individual couldn't be linked to any current-day Indigenous nations. Several local tribes argued that simply because the Ancient One couldn't be positively identified as any one tribe in particular, did not mean that he forfeited the right to be returned to the tribes sharing the land that he once did. This argument was largely rebuffed up until 2017, when the bones were finally put to rest in the hands of several Columbia Plateau tribes, so 21 years after they were discovered. She's still working? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the political use of bodies. So Tiffany Jenkins argues that for many Indigenous communities, outside museums are considered theaters of violence, which kind of gives space for the gaudy display of historical traumas. These museums are often understood to hold ancestors and artifacts hostage, sort of severing their link to their communities of origin. And considering how profound the potential is for maximizing Indigenous pain here, it's no wonder that many communities are rightly skeptical of and resistant towards museum collections. So here's a good example of that. Last year, the British Columbia Museums Association put out a call to museums across Canada to repatriate Indigenous human remains and burial artifacts to their communities of origin. This is in line with UNDRIP's Article 31, which specifically states that Indigenous peoples must have control of their cultural heritage. Worth noting, Canada only signed UNDRIP in 2021, I think. Not great. So in an interview with the CBC, which is the screen cap I've pulled here, Jordan Coble, who is the chair of the BC Museum Association's Indigenous Advisory Committee, states that while many communities wish to rebury their ancestors, others may choose not to. The important thing, he says, is that communities will get the chance to make that final decision if museums in Canada heed this call. So let's turn to a community with a somewhat different perspective. So Jaltecad is a city in southeastern Mexico that has been inhabited since the post-classical period and was originally settled by the Otomi people before being conquered in turn by the Aztecs and the Spanish. So since the 1980s, the people of Jaltecad have been in a collaborative research relationship with many North American archaeologists, including Elizabeth Brumfield and Lisa Overholzer more recently. This began when Brumfield asked to excavate, and when asked why she should be allowed to, she answered that the work would allow the Indigenous inhabitants of Jaltecad to learn their histories and share them with their children. So since then, inhabitants have become research partners in the excavation, setting up public lectures, creating a historical association, and establishing a local museum. And what's more, since 2009, residents have been training in archaeological methods like pottery identification, osteology, and isotope analysis, so that they can move beyond just excavating sites under the direction of outsiders. So one of the museum's most notable exhibitions is the Aztec Household Reconstruction exhibit, which you can see on the left here. This features glass floors with real ancestral human remains featured prominently underfoot. This was enthusiastically proposed and carried out by Indigenous residents of Jaltecad. Elsewhere in Mexico, Overholzer notes that such exhibits are also very common and that Indigenous communities often cite a desire to tangibly show exactly how their ancestors lived and cared for their dead. Household burials are found across the world and speak to a living desire to coexist side by side with deceased family, to keep them at home, to have that link to the world of the ancestors. And in Mexico, as you can see, they're far from rare. In the case of Jaltecon, Indigenous residents are also enthusiastic to display the remains of their ancestors because of what having local ancestors implies. Put most simply, these remains are proof that the Indigenous ancestors of Jaltecon were there. This is where they lived, at least for a time, and died, and their descendants survive to this day, resisting violence and colonial conquest. Anti-Indigenous racism is not unique to any country, and Mexico is no exception. Indigenous inhabitants of Jaltecon have suffered immensely under colonial regimes, and so to be able to put down a set of bones thousands of years old, found in the very same town that you and your grandparents were born, is incredibly powerful. It's an act of both sovereignty and identity, as well as a deeply caring act. And fun fact, when Lisa Overholzer attempted to publish photos of these exhibitions and of the work that they had done in Jaltecon in a conference presentation, she was barred from doing so by the American Archaeology Association. Even though as I was showing you before, the World Archaeological Congress Accords, it actually states that it is up to each Indigenous community to choose how they want their remains treated. It does not bar them from having human remains on display. So in response, she and her collaborator, Juan Argueta, wrote their 2018 article, which I highly, highly recommend. It's the one that's cited just below the photograph on the left. It's really good. So in this case, we see a deeply involved local Indigenous community working with archaeologists to tell stories about their own past. It's pretty much what we might think of as a best case scenario when it comes to collaborative archaeology. Here, human remains are on display because that's how the community feels they can best serve and care for their ancestors. So in conclusion, there's no correct answer to the question, should human remains be displayed? It would be easy if there was, but to even provide a definitive answer would mean ignoring the sheer complexity of the diverse human cultures that make up North America. Well-meaning archaeologists may err on the side of caution and refuse to display or depict any human remains, keeping them hidden from the public. But as we've seen with this single case study, doing so represents an arrogance on the part of the researcher, as unless they actually collaborate or consult with the communities in order to obtain those wishes, the ancestors might still end up in a place that they wouldn't necessarily want to be. So as we've seen highlighted in British Columbia, many descendant communities just want to have their ancestors home, at rest, and reinterred in the proper cultural context. As we've seen in Mexico, sometimes another proper way to care for an ancestor is to have them on display, to affirm their presence in the land and to make tangible the link between past and present. In both cases, what we're talking about is agency and sovereignty. Agency means getting to choose how your ancestors are honored, to have the final call as to where they end up. Sovereignty means affirming your deep history on the land, the fact that you've been here since time immemorial, that you have not disappeared despite colonizers' best efforts, and that you have the agency to decide what's right for your ancestors. Ensuring that Indigenous peoples possess agency and sovereignty in these conversations is the duty of non-Indigenous archaeologists. So if there's any takeaway from this small presentation, I'd like it to be that consensus, firstly, on how to best care for Indigenous human remains varies from community to community across North America, because of course it does. It's ridiculous to assume that there's any one idea of Indigeneity, to fall into the trap of pan-Aboriginalism, to assume that all cultural beliefs are the same. And if there's any call to action to take away from this session, it would be this: for non-Indigenous archaeologists, if you do not belong to the community, never assume you know their wishes unless you ask. And most crucially, never commit to a course of action unless those wishes have been explicitly expressed to you. because it falls on the anthropologist to acknowledge the deep responsibility that comes with handling human remains and to make the most respectful and collaborative choices possible. Because ideally, these decisions should never be made alone. Whenever possible, it is crucial that Indigenous stakeholders are the ones with the power to make that final call. But because we do work under an academic system that prioritizes the power of the institution over the power of the community, sometimes it's not possible to have your grant or your project set up like that. So when it's not possible, it's the duty of the anthropologist to make sure that the final call is the one that is put forth by the implicated communities. Because if we think back to the whole idea of collaborative archaeology, as Sonia Adelaide points out, who's an Anishinaabe archaeologist, researcher, incredible figure. Archaeology that is collaborative is first and foremost for communities. If there's a project that an archaeologist is carrying out that has absolutely no benefit for the community, that is not done with the community, then it's really important to sit and think, well, why does that project matter at all? And why would I expect the help of this community? So that's another thing to keep in mind, the by, the with, and the for. Because if we're doing it for, then we cannot bypass communities' wishes just because we find them inconvenient. So I think that's all I had to say. And yeah, that's my bibliography.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Emma, pour cette excellente présentation extrêmement intéressante, très, très riche en réflexion et en comparaison. Les deux cas sont vraiment extrêmement intéressants. Et ça me rappelait mes études de maîtrise en archéologie, où à l'époque, le slogan est emprunté à Willey and Phillips. On disait à l'époque, Archaeology is anthropology or it is nothing. Et en écoutant ta présentation, je me disais qu'il fallait réviser ce slogan en disant maintenant, archaeology is collaborative or it is nothing. Donc, on va se donner quelques minutes pour des questions, des commentaires. Je ne sais pas qui voudrait intervenir et poser des questions, discuter avec Emma. Allez-y, c'est ouvert.
Vous pouvez ça passer par les questions-réponses, le chat, ou si on peut activer votre micro si vous levez la main.
Je vois une question de Muriel. Oui.
Allô, Emma. Moi, en fait, je me demandais pourquoi tu as pris le cas de Colombie-Britannique et celui du Mexique et pas prendre exemple Canada puis les États-Unis plus spécifiquement.
Oui, premièrement, tout simplement, Lisa Overholzer, c'était ma directrice de thèse pendant mon bac. Fait que, c'est un cas que je connais très, très bien puisque j'ai travaillé un peu sur ça avec elle. Mais aussi parce que c'est un cas où il y a beaucoup de documentation qui a été faite par des archéologues. Donc, il y a un livre de Patricia McInerney qui a été écrit là-dessus et je trouvais que c'était vraiment un cas exemplaire de comment l'archéologie collaborative pouvait se faire, mais également comment les niveaux des différentes communautés se diffèrent. Et j'ai pris le cas de la Colombie-Britannique tout simplement parce que c'était un cas assez récent. Je sais qu'il y avait également une richesse de cas ici au Québec, surtout en ce qui concerne le Montréal, parce que c'est encore contesté, c'est très contesté. Mais ouais, je trouvais que ces deux cas-là étaient des cas qui montraient justement les différences entre les opinions et les faux.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à toi.
J'aurais une question. Pour moi qui ne s'y connais pas tant en archéologie ou bioarchéologie, est-ce qu'il y a du côté des Premières Nations ou des populations autochtones un intérêt de se réapproprier ou de développer des connaissances dans les méthodes archéologiques, comme tu parlais. En fait, je pense que le cas du Mexique, excusez-moi, il y a du bruit en arrière de moi. Est-ce que, dans le fond, justement, ça pourrait pas être une solution, que les fouilles soient faites par les Premières Nations également, ou les populations autochtones?
Oui, oui, à 100%. C'est quelque chose qu'on voit de plus en plus, surtout à travers le Canada, je dois dire. Je pense premièrement au Institute of Indigenous and Prairie Archaeology à l'Université d'Alberta. Donc, il existe déjà des programmes pour intégrer, pas juste intégrer, mais donner les formations pour que dans le futur, dans 10 ans, 20 ans, on pourrait voir justement des archéologues qui viennent de la communauté qui dirigent des fouilles sur leur territoire à eux. Ouais, c'est quelque chose qu'on commence à voir de plus en plus. Ouais, donc ça me bouge dans la bonne direction.
Super, merci. Monsieur Crépeau, on ne vous entend pas.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions encore pour Emma? Sinon, je voulais demander à Emma de nous parler peut-être brièvement de l'histoire de l'homme de Kennewick que tu as mentionné. Moi, je n'ai pas suivi les développements récents, mais c'est une découverte qui avait été effectivement très, très contestée. Et ce que tu disais, c'est que finalement, ça s'est réglé en 2017. Pourrais-tu nous dire un peu comment ça s'est passé?
Oui, donc ça, de ce que je comprends, c'était le cas le plus répandu dans les médias aux États-Unis en tout ce qui concerne NAGPRA, parce que ouais, les restes ont été découverts 6 ans après que NAGPRA a été passé par le Congrès. Donc, ouais, ce sont des restes humains qui ont été trouvés dans le bassin Columbia aux États-Unis. Et il y avait, aux États-Unis, il y a toujours un state archaeologist qui est le responsable pour gérer tous les trouvailles qui sont effectuées aux États-Unis dans chaque État. Donc, je pense que c'était James Burke, le state archaeologist. Son argument, c'était que parce que ça faisait quand même 9000 ans que l'homme de Kennewick est mort, c'est impossible de trouver un tribut contemporain pour pouvoir rapatrier les restes. Fait que c'était impossible. On ne pouvait pas se faire. Donc, ça donnait un peu comme la carte blanche aux archéologues de faire ce qu'ils voulaient avec les restes. Donc, ils ont effectué beaucoup d'analyses de l'ADN, des isotopes. Ils ont beaucoup fait avec les restes, mais finalement, en 2017, je ne sais pas c'est quoi qui a changé pour... je n'ai pas vu de comme, changement à NAGPRA dans la législation pour faire que l'homme pourrait rapatrier. Mais du coup, en 2017, peut-être c'était un changement au niveau gouvernemental dans l'État. Les tribus locales du bassin colombien, en incluant les Umatia, qui ont vraiment lancé cette lutte en 1996, ont finalement eu droit de réenterrer les restes. Donc, ouais, maintenant, c'est réglé, mais ça a pris quand même 21 ans.
Oui, c'était très médiatisé à l'époque, tu as raison. Hein, il y avait énormément de débats. Les mentalités ont beaucoup changé en 21 ans, je pense, par rapport à cette question. Ça évolue encore maintenant. Et au Canada et au Québec en particulier, comment tu vois la situation?
Ben, au Canada, je suis quand même optimiste. Je trouve que même si on devrait avoir une législation comme l'ANCIPRA au Canada, ça m'étonne que ça n'existe pas. Mais à la fois, on voit que les archéologues qui commencent à... qui trouvent de la notoriété au Canada, qui émergent, sont de plus en plus des archéologues autochtones. Et je sais que même si on n'a pas de législation, ça continue d'improver. Je pense aussi à l'Université de Montréal et le projet Teotihuacan qui commence, qui est un projet égalitaire remporté entre 3 parties, Pointe-à-Calière, UDM et le Mohawk Council of Ganawage. Ça, je pense que on comprend que si c'est pas égalitaire, si c'est pas, on n'est pas tous sur la même base, on peut pas effectuer de la bonne recherche. Même si on peut regarder ça comme dans un volet humanitaire, que c'est pas, la moralité n'est pas là si on vole des restes humains et on refuse de les enterrer, mais on peut aussi regarder ça également d'une perspective scientifique. Si on n'a pas cette collaboration, si on n'a pas ces recherches holistiques, ben, c'est impossible de faire de la bonne science. Donc, je pense que de plus en plus, on reconnaît ces faits-là. Et donc, pour l'instant, je suis très optimiste au Canada. Je pense à comme Keisha Supernant, qui est une archéologue métis, qui a vraiment comme pris charge sur justement cette question de pensionnat. Donc, c'est elle est une archéologue autochtone qui approche les communautés avec toutes les sensibilités, toute l'émotion, tout le respect qui est dû. Et elle gère ses projets d'une manière très collaborative et très... elle sait. Elle connaît la douleur, elle connaît l'importance de ce projet-là. Donc, c'est des archéologues comme elle qui mènent cette lutte, on pourrait dire, ce changement dans la culture archéologique du Canada.
Alors, merci. Est-ce qu'on aura le temps peut-être pour une dernière question, s'il y a des questions? Non, ça va. De toute façon, on peut y revenir. On va avoir une période à la fin des présentations pour un débat. Donc, on va passer maintenant à notre deuxième conférence.